Okay, great. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us, for watching our video, and for checking out the IMS Mara Public Outreach Partnership pages. Today I'm talking with Anny Gaul. Anny Gaul is a cultural historian studying food and gender in the Middle East. She's currently an assistant professor of Arabic studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she teaches classes on culture, gender history, literature, and food of the Arabic-speaking world. She's currently writing a book that tells the story of modern Egypt through a cultural history of the tomato, which we'll get to later in the interview. She has also taught at Georgetown and Tufts University, works as a translator from Arabic, and has a food blog at Cooking with Gaul, that's GAUL.com. Her PhD is from Georgetown, and Anny has received awards and fellowships from the Fulbright Program, the Social Science Research Council, the Council of American Overseas Research Centers, the American Research Center in Egypt, and the American Institute for Maghrebi Studies. Thank you so much for joining us today, Anny.
Thanks so much for having me and for that great introduction.
Great. So first, could you tell us a bit more about Egyptian cuisine and perhaps the position of bread within that cuisine and whether that position varies by social class?
So Egypt is, of course, very well known for a very long history of agriculture in the Nile Valley, but it's also long been an important place in global trade routes. And both of those geographic factors have really informed what Egyptian cuisine has been over time. So you have, on the one hand, a number of elements that are really rooted in a local agricultural tradition that goes back sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. But then with this constant influx of foods from other places, and that happened in pharaonic times, it happened in medieval times, and it continues to happen today. So just a couple of examples of how that sort of influence of trade and migration is brought to bear on today's Egyptian cuisine. One example is popular dishes that involve tomatoes and potatoes. So those are very common today in Egyptian cooking, but they're both foods that are indigenous to the Americas. And so they didn't come to Egypt until the Ottoman period at the earliest. And then another great example that I think is really interesting is a casserole dish called macarona bechamel, which comes to Egypt by way of a Greek version of that dish called pastizio, which reflects the restaurant culture of the early 20th century. It's made with pasta with bechamel sauce, which is, of course, a French mother sauce. And it's baked with ground meat and tomato sauce and some other ingredients. And so there's a sort of pretty direct, we can see how that dish traveled from outside Egypt into Egyptian culture, but it's become completely Egyptianized, embraced. It's a staple of kind of comfort food and home cooking, but you can also buy it outside the home at this point. And so that is enjoyed to an equal degree alongside dishes with much older histories going back to medieval period, Greco-Roman, or even Pharaonic Egypt. So one example of those longer rooted food traditions is, of course, growing wheat and using it to make bread. So wheat has been cultivated in Egypt for thousands of years. And as Jessica Barnes argues in her recent book, Staple Security, on one hand, we have this history going way back of wheat and bread. But on the other hand, the varieties of wheat, the type of wheat that's grown, the way it's produced, the way it's cultivated, and the kinds of bread that have been made from it have changed pretty dramatically throughout history. And so you have this kind of tendency for like change and adaptation on one hand, constantly incorporating new ingredients and culinary influences into existing kind of longstanding traditions that to me is really the hallmark of Egyptian cuisine. And so in terms of what role bread plays today, it's an everyday staple. It's a very common food. I think it's important to know that it's both a utensil and a food. So it's not just part of the meal, it's also integral to kind of the choreography of how people eat food. And so the most common kind of bread in Egypt is a flat bread that you can tear and use as a utensil for not just an accompaniment, but actually a way that food is consumed. You see it in examples in street food outside of the home. So Ful medames is stewed fava beans, a very, very popular food in Egypt. And one way that it's commonly consumed is in a sandwich form. So you can see street carts and vendors all over cities in Egypt selling sandwiches made with this kind of round loaf with fava beans and other things inside of it. But then it's also essential in home cooking. And so it accompanies a lot of the more traditional dishes at home as well. So you can kind of see it in a lot of different culinary contexts. And of course, it's very famously today subsidized. There's a particular kind of bread loaf in Egypt that is subsidized by the state. The state places a very high priority on acquiring wheat reserves and processing that into bread that's subsidized for the majority of Egyptians. So it's come to really be a part of what Egyptians expect of what the state will provide them. And even though it has this very important symbolic meaning and cultural meaning and culinary function, I would say for all Egyptians, sort of at all, levels of society, all sort of socioeconomic classes, it's particularly important for non-elite Egyptians because it's subsidized, because the price is fixed and doesn't change. So it's this reliable source of calories with a fixed price, which is particularly important as the prices for all kinds of other foods change with inflation, with shortages, with the devaluation of the pound, as we're seeing right now. So it's sort of a constant. There is another book that recently came out about bread politics in Jordan by Jose Martinez, States of Subsistence, which is also really great. And he makes the observation that even though in any sort of socioeconomic class in Jordan, you might see a very similar type of meal, like similar foods, similar recipes are being made. Bread is at all of them. But for a lower income person or lower income family, bread is more likely to make up a higher proportion of the calories in that same meal, which I think is a good observation. And I imagine is likely the case for many families in Egypt as well, that even though there are foods sort of eaten across the social spectrum, the sort of reliance of a lot of people on that subsidized bread for a large proportion of calories is really significant for a lot of people, and more so some than others.
Right. Yeah, thanks for plugging Jose's book. He'll actually be here with us at the Institute in March. So those who are interested, we do record those conversations with authors of new books. So if you're super interested in bread and want to go beyond this this IMPOP page, you can check out our IMIS YouTube page where we have recordings of all our events, and Jose's recording should be up in mid to late March. So for those interested, you can check that out also. You mentioned Jessica Barnes's book, Staple Security. She also has an article, right, which is excerpted below on this page, actually, which is about how the Egyptian government sources wheat for that very large subsidized bread program, right, which affects about, I think, 70% of Egyptians. And the price has been fixed at, I think, 5 piastres, right, since the late 80s. So issues like, where does the wheat come from? How refined is the wheat product going to be? How are price supports going to be deployed to encourage domestic wheat production? All of these very sort of complex questions. But how about other kinds of bread? Right? Bread, for example, made from corn, and how has that been important in the past in Egypt, and how might sourcing that those different commodities be different from the sourcing and the control and the propagation of wheat?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different types of bread that are produced in Egypt. I teach Arabic and I'm very interested in language. So one thing I'm quite interested in is the names that are used to describe different types of bread. The subsidized bread that you typically hear about that's really important, that's the staple food, is actually called baladi bread, which I think is so interesting because baladi in Arabic literally means of the country. It sort of works in the way that country works in English, where it can sometimes imply the countryside or a rural area. If you pair baladi with any other kind of food, like semna baladi, like baladi clarified butter, that is, or baladi meat, it really implies traditional form of food, something that's maybe handcrafted, something that's sourced from the countryside. Whereas baladi bread, as we know it today, is, in some ways it's part of a tradition of bread making in Egypt, but in other ways it's subsidized, it's standardized, it's mass produced in these ways. So it's really interesting how swiftly something like that is sort of given this title traditional. And then an interesting flip side to that is, as you hinted at, there are other kinds of bread that have been made and continue to be made in Egypt without subsidies. Some of them were subsidized and they no longer are. So one example is Shami bread. So for those who know Arabic, Sham or Shami refers to Syrian or Levantine, that sort of part of the Eastern Mediterranean, that part of the Middle East, where we have Syria, Lebanon, Palestine today. And that is very similar to the typical subsidized loaf, but it's with a more refined kind of flour. So there's less bran. It's less like a wheat bread that we might think of in the US and more like a white bread. It's much softer, so the texture is quite different. And again, I think it's really interesting, the label Shami that's used with that. Part of my research is looking into the influences of Shami food in general on Egyptian cuisine, which there have been connections between the Levant and Egypt, culinary connections for thousands of years again, but there's a pretty distinct wave of influence that starts in the late 19th century as trade routes change with the opening of the Suez Canal. And a lot of merchant families relocate from what's now Syria to Egypt and bring a lot of foodways with them. So I don't know the exact etymology of when this kind of bread started getting called shami, but that's something that, has a specific history and is now just sort of an everyday common name that people use to refer to this kind of bread. Another really interesting type of bread that came up in oral history interviews that I did during my field work, I would always ask people, are there foods that your grandmother made or your mother made that are not made anymore? Something your grandmother knew how to make that you don't know how to make, or something you remember eating in early childhood that you don't see anymore. And a really common response, I was interviewing women from sort of various parts of the middle classes living in Cairo and Alexandria. So that's kind of the population I was speaking to. A lot of them mentioned batao, which is a type of traditional bread, often made with a little bit of wheat, but more with corn or sorghum flour. So the interesting thing about making breads with corn flour and some of these other materials is that there's no or very little gluten in that kind of bread. And so fenugreek, halba in Arabic, is added to these kinds of bread, which brings a flavor. It's a very divisive flavor. I happen to love it, but some people hate it. So some people would say, oh, my grandmother had this kind of bread, but I hate that smell and nobody makes it anymore. Of course, people do make it still, but not maybe on the scale that they did, or there's sort of a response to the flavor of the fenugreek, but the fenugreek also has a lot of mucilage in it. So it actually, when you soak fenugreek seeds in water, it creates a kind of like gummy texture, which can help bind bread together. And fenugreek is something that is documented going way back in Egyptian history. Corn, of course, is an American food, a so-called New World food. And so there's sort of layers of when these ingredients of this kind of bread entered Egypt, its geographical boundaries. But today, that's a kind of bread that's considered by, I would say, middle-class Egyptians. I don't want to generalize too much, but by a lot of people, they would say, oh, that's less common. It's more traditional. It's more rural. Requires a certain kind of oven to make it. And so today that's construed as a very traditional bread, even though it has these sort of layers of history to it. And corn is obviously doesn't have as long a history as wheat does. But even the way that cornbread and wheat bread have been produced and perceived has changed so much over time. And so I mentioned the devaluation of the Egyptian pound In the past year, it's really reached a new low, the power of the pound. And so as the purchasing power of anyone spending in Egyptian pounds is weakened, then accessing other kinds of bread becomes even more difficult, and that subsidized wheat loaf becomes even more important.
Right. So although it's remained 5 piastres, those piastres, right, are more and more sort of dear as the pound is further devalued, right?
The other thing I would add is that even though the price of a loaf of bread has remained the same, the size of that loaf has shrunk over time. And so there's some great infographics out there and people who have talked about the fact that even the 5 piastres you're spending on a loaf is not going as far in terms of how much it fills you up over time.
Right. The Egyptian paper Mada Masar, right, actually has some great infographics on the size of baladi bread. So that's actually listed under the resources, which will also be included at the bottom of this page.
Great. Yeah, it's like a really striking visual. And Egyptians know this, obviously. They're very aware of the fact that like the price is the same, but it is not buying you as much bread, even the subsidized bread, as it used to.
It is interesting that the price is somehow more untouchable, right, than the size, right?
Yeah.
It's that how important that price attachment is to
yeah,
people.
It also has this kind of symbolic resonance to it, I guess, in political rhetoric.
Yeah, sure, right. There's probably a lot of idiomatic speech in Egypt that references sort of 5 piastres because it's the basis for subsidized bread. It'd be interesting to look into that. It's a great project for someone someone listening. You work with a range of historical sources, including cookbooks. Have you ever come across interesting recipes for bread other than the ones you mentioned, or other notable Egyptian dishes or broader regional dishes that may feature wheat as an ingredient, but that maybe aren't bread?
Yeah, it is really interesting to see which kinds of bread make their way into cookbooks. A lot of my research focuses on a particular genre of print cookbooks that emerge in Egypt starting in the 1930s, written by and for women. So prior to that, most cookbooks or recipe collections written in Arabic going back to the 10th century are written by men. And you have women beginning to write cookbooks, particularly in Egypt in the 30s, 40s, 50s. One of the most famous is known as Abla Nazira. She's a household name in Egypt. She co-wrote a really famous canonical kind of biblical cookbook in the early 40s with Bahia Osman. What's interesting is that they both were part of a generation of many Egyptian women who were sent by the state to study different topics in higher education in England in the 1920s. And so this was a time when women's education was expanding in Egypt. There was huge demand for girls' education in particular, but not enough locally trained Egyptian women to teach in secondary schools. And so they started sending women to England to get advanced degrees in various things. And a lot of them studied domestic science and cookery in England. And so they came back and started writing cookbooks and textbooks that translated a lot of their, or really all of their curricula into Arabic, but then also included recipes for local traditional foods. So Abla Nazira's big cookbook, for example, doesn't include a recipe for batao, but she does include a recipe for khubz baladi bread, which includes a description of how to make your own yeast, kind of like how to do a sourdough starter, basically. But most of her bread recipes are European breads. So how to fold a dough to make it like a baguette style shaped loaf, sandwich bread for like tea sandwiches that are more British style, and things like that are what tend to get written down in the written recipes. I think largely probably because of the assumption that traditional breads were things that people didn't need recipes for. Those kinds of recipes didn't always make it into these books, which were really trying to introduce new foods, to modernize cooking techniques and so forth. To me, one of the most interesting ways that wheat has this new chapter in Egyptian food history that I see in these cookbooks is the way that it shows up in French style sauces and in pasta dishes. So there are versions of like what we would call maybe noodles in medieval Arabic texts going way back hundreds of years, but modern style, the kind of semolina pasta that we think of today that you buy in a box was, again, a more recent introduction to Egypt. I mentioned Greek influence, Italians also. There were a lot of Italians living in Egypt. A lot of the grocers were Greek. A lot of the restaurants were owned by Greeks and Italians. And so I think this is perhaps partly explains why pasta became so popular in Egypt. And there were companies set up to actually manufacture dried pasta, sort of Italian style pasta, what we might think of, in the early 20th century. So it caught on and then starts to appear in all these different ways. So macaroni bechamel, a casserole dish that I mentioned, becomes a staple of Egyptian cooking. Koshari is a street food that is loosely based, related to the Indian dish khichdi. So the base is rice and lentils, and then the Egyptians add macaroni to it. So add sort of elbow pasta to it. So it's really interesting to think about that as it is another wheat product, but in a completely different guise, sort of coming back. And then the other really interesting place that wheat comes into, I mean, there's a lot of interesting examples of wheat that show up in these cookbooks. But bechamel sauce becomes also very important in French, in a sort of French influenced takes on local foods. So not just macaroni bechamel, but adding bechamel sauce to eggplants or to artichokes or to other sort of local vegetables and dishes becomes a trend in mid-century Egypt. And that is a French sauce that begins with a roux, which means that you take a fat, usually butter and flour, and mix them together till they're completely blended. And then you add a liquid. In bechamel's case, you add milk. But what's quite interesting is that the recipes for sauces that are made like this in a lot of Egyptian cookbooks don't call for butter, they call for semna, or clarified butter, which again is such an interesting kind of Egyptian take, an Egyptianization of this classical French sauce technique. Again, using flour, using wheat flour.
That's so interesting. Especially since we think of the trouble that the government is having importing sufficient amount of wheat to put into subsidized bread, but then we also think about the pasta makers and the restaurants and all of those operators who need presumably a constant flow of wheat, and where that is also coming from, and is that getting held up, or are there shortages in those other industries? It's definitely has impacts far beyond just subsidized bread. I understand that you're working on a book about a particular food that has a much shorter history of consumption in Egypt. Do you want to tell us a bit about that project?
Absolutely. I am working on a history of the tomato in Egypt. Tomatoes are indigenous to South America. They were first cultivated, domesticated in what's now Mexico. And so we don't know exactly when they were first introduced to Egypt, probably at some point during the Ottoman period. And so far in my research, it's unclear. I'm not sure we can really definitively say if it comes to Egypt via the Mediterranean or through the Ottoman Empire. But it's a relatively recently introduced food, right? Today, Egypt is one of the world's leading producers of tomatoes. So the last time the FAO released statistics, I think Egypt was the 5th largest producer of tomatoes in the world, which is huge, right? And they consume most of that. They don't export very many tomatoes. So Egyptians grow and eat a ton of tomatoes, and it appears in so many different dishes. And so it's a great sort of through line, a way of talking about what makes modern Egyptian cuisine modern. Like the tomato transforms a lot of traditional dishes. It gets added to traditional dishes. It becomes central to new dishes that are introduced and so forth. And so part of my project is asking, well, how did we get there? How did the cuisine transform in this way? Part of that involves identifying and tracing the history of a very specific Egyptian lexicon for words related to tomato. So different Arabic dialects have different words for the word tomato. And one of the Egyptian words that's used is uta, which is a great word. It's so I've been trying to kind of pin down the origin of that word. My working theory right now is that it predates Arabic. It's not a word of Arabic origin, so it connects to other histories in the Nile Valley region that I'm looking into. And there's also much more recently coined words, like the word salsa, which has been in Arabic for a long time to refer to a sauce or a condiment in a more kind of generic way. And in Egypt, in Egyptian Arabic, really specifically means tomato puree, which is then in turn a really important ingredient in a number of different dishes. But I find that so interesting that salsa has come to have this very specific connotation in Egyptian Arabic. And then there are a number of different cooking techniques and words for sauces made from tomatoes and so forth. Another kind of angle of this is to look at transformations of the landscape. And so what is it that made growing enough tomatoes for such a huge population possible? And a lot of that has to do with, of course, the damming of the Nile, the high dam, but also earlier dams. Tomatoes require a fair amount of water. And so having control over irrigation is pretty important for producing the amount of tomatoes that Egypt produces. But for tomato production, as well as yields, so how many tomatoes they can get out of an acre, have generally increased since tomato cultivation began. So there are a lot of research projects in Egypt looking at improving yields, protecting tomatoes against diseases and other threats, developing varieties that grow the best in different parts of Egypt during different seasons and so forth. And a last really interesting part that I'll mention, which ties a little bit to what we talked about before, is that tomatoes are kind of important enough to receive some attention from the state, but not nearly on the scale or with the intensity that bread and wheat receive. So there have been some attempts to control prices, regulate the wholesale markets where tomatoes are sold in cities and so forth. But generally speaking, the prices of tomatoes have gone up over time, and certainly they've gone up relative to the price of a loaf of bread. And they're famous for their volatility. And I think that's partly having to do with the materiality of tomatoes themselves, that they're very difficult. They spoil very quickly. They're difficult to transport. They're difficult to store. So they're sort of a tricky vegetable to have as a commodity in one's cuisine. And then there's sort of seasonal changes. So Egypt can grow tomatoes year round, but they tend to be more expensive in winter than they are in summer. And so since at least the 50s, as far back as I've traced this, the street cry for vendors selling tomatoes in the street is Magnuna Yauta, which means crazy tomatoes, basically, which refers to the volatility in price. And it's just sort of accepted that that tomatoes might fluctuate in price, even though they're central to the way that a lot of people now cook at home. A lot of really basic dishes are made in tomato stews or tomato sauces. And so it's this really interesting example of something that's, it crops up in political cartoons, street vendors. It's sort of the refrain of Magnuna Yauta or Magnuna Ya something else becomes a way to kind of indirectly complain about the pressures that ordinary Egyptians are facing with the price of food, with these fluctuations in prices. And it's sort of, doesn't escape the state's notice, but it's not quite as tightly regulated as some other important commodities.
Right, which does, I guess, make some sense since tomatoes may not be as filling, right? as bread. So
Yeah, it's
it makes
interesting.
sense.
They're, I mean, something I'm looking into is how important they are in carrying flavor. But in terms of how, the state is defining food security, it's not going to be about flavor. It's going to be about calories and sort of needs defined in a very different way.
Right. And if tomato is so full of water, right, the caloric content is probably
Exactly.
much lower,
Yeah.
right? If the most of what you're getting is water, um, which of course is important and difficult to get sometimes, I guess, depending on, I mean, most agriculture being Nile fed rather than rain fed, of course.
Exactly.
Um, so one final question. You write about the history of kitchens and culinary practices, and you teach courses on food and culture in the Middle East, but you're also a cook yourself, and you have your own food blog, as I mentioned earlier, cookingwithgaul, GAUL.com. How has cooking shaped your own research and teaching? Do you ever incorporate cooking demonstrations in your classes, or have suggested places that teachers can find things like that for their own classroom? And anything that you give us maybe after this, we'll incorporate into the resources that are listed at the bottom of the page.
I really love cooking as a research method and as something that's really great to do with students. I have done a couple of cooking demonstrations in classes. I've cooked koshari for students. I've done a couscous demonstration for students, which is another wheat product from North Africa. So that's fun because it requires a specific type of cookware, so students can see the difference in couscous when you steam it with a sort of specialized equipment as opposed to just boiling it in water. I've also assigned a final project option. I teach a food studies class, sort of food cultures in the Middle East class, and just introduced this year an option for a final project where students could choose to do a traditional research paper, or they could do a cooking demonstration with a presentation, basically, where they presented the history of a food, a little bit about the culture or politics or economics of its ingredients, and then demonstrated a key step in making it. And so that's really fun too for students who are interested in that, to actually have to cook their way through a recipe. It just forces you to have a different relationship with a recipe. You realize things that places where you need help, places where you need to look for videos or have a person come cook with you. There are all kinds of things that aren't captured in written recipes. And so it can be really eye-opening to cook your way through things, which I find too myself. I mean, I've mentioned bechamel many times in this discussion, but cooking bechamel, and actually when I started studying Egyptian food, I had never made a bechamel sauce. I didn't know how to make one. And so, I sort of read about it. There's a lot in the literature on French food history about the evolution of these kinds of sauces and what kinds of techniques and stove equipment and technology are used to make them. And at some point I realized, well, I need to actually try to cook one myself. And I had never made a roux, I had never made a bechamel. And you realize very quickly how difficult it is and how hard it is to especially learn one from a book, something like this. And so, I, in this day and age, Googled a bunch of YouTube videos and looked at demonstrations. How should it look? How brown should the flour get? And all of this sort of thing. But it also prompted me to ask really specific questions when I was interviewing women about when bechamel entered their family repertoire, to ask, well, how did you learn it? Because I realized that just because they had a cookbook that explained the steps of making bechamel, for a lot of people, and this isn't just true of bechamel or French food, this is true of a lot of different kinds of foods, but cooking your way through a recipe can really direct the kinds of questions that you ask about it when you're trying to understand how it gets transmitted, how it gets taught, and so forth. So I find it a really fun research method to actually cook the things that I'm studying about when I can.
Yeah, sounds like the best research method, actually. Thank you so much, Annie. This has really been wonderful. Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, no problem.